On February 14, 2026, Canada officially signed its participation agreement in the European Union's Security Action for Europe, SAFE, the €150 billion defence financing instrument that is reshaping how the continent arms itself. That is approximately 244 billion Canadian dollars in a joint defence procurement fund. Canada became the only non-European nation on Earth to secure preferential access to it. Not the United Kingdom, not Australia, not Japan, Canada. The country Trump called a future 51st state, the country he tried to break with tariffs, the country he thought would fold, it did not fold. It showed up in Brussels and signed a deal that changes the architecture of transatlantic security for the next decade. Now, here is what the administration did not anticipate. This was not a defensive move. And this was a strategic offensive. Carney did not run to Europe because he was scared. He ran to Europe because he understood something Trump does not, and that the global order is being reconstructed right now in real time, and the countries that position themselves inside that reconstruction will have power. The ones that stand outside it, demanding loyalty they no longer earn, will hemorrhage influence they cannot get back. Let us talk about the mechanics of SAFE, because understanding the instrument is how you understand the gravity of what Carney just secured. The SAFE regulation was adopted on May 27, 2025, as the first pillar of the EU's Readiness 2030 plan. A program designed to surge defense investment across the bloc in the face of Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine and, critically, growing uncertainty about American reliability as a security guarantor. The fund provides low-interest loans to EU member states for joint procurement of defense capabilities. Priority spending areas include missiles and ammunition, artillery systems, ground combat capabilities, drone and anti-drone systems, cyber warfare capabilities, air and missile defense, maritime forces, electronic warfare, and space assets protection. This is not a modest spending program. This is a continent rearming at industrial scale. Here is the hidden connection that nobody is talking about. There is a critical provision buried inside the SAFE regulation, the European Preference Clause. In order to qualify for SAFE funding, no more than 35% of the value of any weapons system procured can originate outside the EU, Ukraine, or European Economic Area partner countries. That means 65 cents of every dollar spent under this program must stay within the approved industrial zone. The United States, under this framework, is outside. Canada, because of the agreement Carney negotiated, is inside. Let that sink in for a moment. Canada has walked through a door that the United States has been shut out of. Canadian defense companies can now bid on joint European procurement contracts that American firms cannot. Canadian manufacturers can embed themselves into the supply chains of European rearmament in ways that their American competitors are explicitly excluded from. This is not just a diplomatic achievement. This is an industrial and economic repositioning of historic proportions. The Trump administration saw this coming, and that is why they filed a formal complaint on February 13, 2026. One day before Canada signed the SAFE agreement into force, warning European allies that their buy-European defense procurement policies were protectionist and exclusionary. The submission was direct. Protectionist and exclusionary policies that strong-arm American companies out of the market when Europe's largest defense firms continue to greatly benefit from market access in the United States are the wrong course of action. The filing warned that cutting American companies out of European procurement could weaken NATO capability targets and violate commitments under the US-EU trade framework, which included an EU pledge to buy more American weapons. Washington views Europe's defense industrial ramp-up as an economic threat. That is the explicit language from US officials. And here is where the story gets devastating for Washington. The administration filed that complaint on February 13th. Canada signed the SAFE agreement the very next day. The message could not have been more surgical. While the Trump administration was lobbying Europe to keep American defense companies in the room, Canada, America's supposed junior partner, was signing itself into the seat at the head of the table that the United States had just been told it could not have. Now let us go back further, because this did not begin in February. The architecture of what Carney has built with Europe was assembled over 12 months of deliberate, methodical diplomacy that began the moment Mark Carney became Canada's 24th Prime Minister on March 14, 2025. His first foreign trip as Prime Minister was not to Washington. It was to Paris and London. That was a signal. A former governor of the Bank of England, the first non-citizen to hold that position in the bank's 300-year history, flying to the capitals that shaped Canada's founding identity. The message was not subtle. Canada was going home, and it was not going to Washington to ask permission. In June 2025, at the EU-Canada summit in Brussels, Carney and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen signed the new EU-Canada Strategic Partnership of the Future, a comprehensive security and defense partnership that established the framework for everything that followed. High Representative Kaja Kallas said it plainly: Canada is one of the EU's closest partners and a trusted friend. The agreement covered the full spectrum of security and defense. It laid the legal and institutional groundwork for Canada's eventual participation in SAFE. It was the foundation. Then came Davos, January 2026, and that is where the rupture became impossible to ignore. Carney stood at the World Economic Forum and delivered a speech that stopped rooms. He did not mention Trump's name once. He did not need to. Middle powers must act together, he said, because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. He announced that Canada had agreed a comprehensive strategic partnership with the EU, including joining SAFE. He announced 12 other trade and security deals across 4 continents in 6 months. He announced negotiations with India, ASEAN, Thailand, the Philippines, and Mercosur. He told the world that Canada had already concluded new strategic partnerships with China and Qatar. He said, "Simon, I want you to hear this precisely. We can nostalgically look back and long for the old order to somehow return, or we can build a new one with purpose and partnership." The room understood. Trump understood. And Trump's response was what it always is when someone publicly refuses to be subordinate: rage. He threatened Canada with 100% tariffs if they pursued any deal with China. He posted an AI-generated image of a map that included Canada as American territory. He withdrew Carney's invitation to his so-called Board of Peace. He said Canada's existence was dependent on the United States and that Carney should show more gratitude. Carney's response was 6 words, delivered with the calm precision of a man who has set interest rates for central banks of 2 G7 nations. He said, "I meant what I said in Davos, not a flinch. Not a hedge, not a retreat." Canada was the first country, he said, to understand the change in U.S. foreign policy. "There is almost nothing normal in the U.S. now," Carney told Parliament, "and that's the truth. Now let us talk about the numbers, because the numbers are merciless." Canada and the EU had already been building something before Trump's second term accelerated the process. Canada-EU bilateral merchandise trade increased by more than 77% between 2016 and 2025. The CETA agreement, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and the EU, had already been provisionally applied since September 2017, creating preferential market access across virtually all sectors. Canada had been a third state participant in EU permanent structured cooperation since 2021. The institutional pipes were already there. Carney did not build this from scratch. He turned the pressure up to maximum and forced the water through. But here is the scale of the strategic repositioning that is now underway. Carney has publicly stated that more than 70 cents of every dollar of Canadian military capital spending will no longer go to the United States. That is not a rounding error. Canada's defense budget runs into the tens of billions. Redirecting 70% of military procurement spending away from American defense contractors and into Canadian-built, European-partnered supply chains is an industrial severance. The Defense Production Sharing Agreement, the bilateral framework that has tied Canada's defense industry to the American market for decades, is being functionally superseded by a new set of relationships built in Brussels, not Washington. The University of Toronto's economics professor Joseph Steinberg documented what was already happening at the trade level before SAFE was even signed. Canadian exports to the United States fell by approximately 16% in 2025, year over year, while exports to non-US countries rose by approximately 17%. The reorientation is not theoretical. It is already in the data. Carney's stated goal is to double Canada's non-US exports within a decade. That goal, 6 months ago, sounded like political rhetoric. Today, with Canada inside SAFE, inside the EU's strategic partnership framework, with deals active or in negotiation across India, ASEAN, Japan, Australia, South Korea, the UAE, Qatar, and the Mercosur bloc, it sounds like a project that is already underway. Now let us talk about what Europe got. So because the other side of this exchange deserves its own accounting, Europe has been screaming for a reliable, values-aligned partner in the transatlantic space for 18 months. Trump threatened tariffs on Denmark for not ceding Greenland. He cast doubt on Article 5 of the NATO Mutual Defense Clause, asking publicly whether the United States would defend European allies at all. His vice president, J.D. Vance, delivered a speech at the February 2025 Munich Security Conference that the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace described as a declaration of ideological war against Europe. Washington pulled out of 66 international organizations and UN entities in January 2026. It froze or cut most financial contributions to the UN. It renamed the Department of Defense the Department of War. The signal was unambiguous. Europe needed a partner who would show up, not rhetorically, institutionally, with money, with industrial capacity, with legal commitment. Canada showed up. The SAFE Agreement is not a press release. It is a binding legal instrument with financial contributions, procurement commitments, and supply chain integration clauses. Canadian companies are now embedded in Europe's rearmament effort at the structural level. Canadian pension funds, with $2 trillion in capital, have been dispatched to build investment relationships on 4 continents. The UAE alone committed to invest $70 billion in Canada following Carney's Abu Dhabi visit. Canada is not a spectator in the new world order being constructed outside Washington's control. It is one of its principal architects. Now let us talk about the United Kingdom. Because the British comparison makes the stakes undeniable. London and Brussels spent months negotiating whether the UK could join SAFE. Those talks collapsed. The United Kingdom, a NATO founding member, a nuclear power, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, with a defense industry second only to the United States in the Western Alliance, could not get into the program that Canada just signed in February. The UK is still on the outside. Canada is on the inside. And the reason is straightforward. Carney moved faster, committed harder, and offered Europe something the UK has not, an unambiguous strategic realignment. Canada did not spend months hedging about its relationship with Washington before showing up in Brussels. It arrived already decided. Here is what makes this a national security crisis for the United States. Not just an economic humiliation. Defense procurement relationships are not transactional. They are generational. Once a country's military supply chains are integrated into a foreign industrial network, once the engineers are embedded, the production standards are aligned, the spare parts dependencies are established, those relationships do not reverse in a single election cycle. The decisions being made in European defense ministries right now about which countries' companies will manufacture the missiles, the drones, the electronic warfare systems, the armored vehicles of the next 2 decades, are decisions that will shape the geopolitical landscape of the 2040s. And Canada has just positioned itself inside those decisions. The United States, because of the European preference clause it is furious about, has been explicitly priced out. The Trump administration's executive order, signed in early February, aimed to reinforce the United States as the arms maker of choice for allies and speed up Washington decision-making to get weapons to foreign militaries faster. The intent was to reassert American industrial dominance over Allied procurement. It was too late. The SAFE framework was already ratified. Canada was already in. The executive order was the right strategy, wrong timing, wrong decade. It is a tourniquet applied to a wound that has already been sutured shut by someone else. There is a deeper pattern here that history keeps trying to teach and the great powers keep refusing to learn. When British manufacturing began relocating to the American colonies in the late 18th century, Parliament tried tariffs, restrictions, and outright export bans on machinery and skilled workers. It did not work. Capital found a way, talent found a way, institutions found a way. The gravitational center of economic power shifted slowly and then all at once, and no amount of political pressure from the imperial capital reversed it. The lesson is not comfortable, but it is consistent. Countries that make themselves reliable partners in growth get rewarded with integration. Countries that use economic coercion as a substitute for partnership get circumvented. Trump's theory of America was built in the 1980s. Real estate, leverage, zero-sum transactions. The idea that you can threaten an ally into dependency, that tariffs are a scalpel that can carve out compliance, belongs to an era when the United States had no competition for the role of indispensable partner. That era is over. The EU's SAFE program, the Readiness 2030 plan, the comprehensive defense partnership with Canada, the accelerating trade diversification across the Indo-Pacific, these are not reactions to Trump. They are the construction of a new order that will outlast him. Trump did not cause this, but he accelerated it by years, maybe decades. The political fallout inside Washington is only beginning to crystallize. The American defense industry, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing Defense, General Dynamics, has spent decades building market relationships with European governments. Those relationships were assumed to be permanent. The SAFE framework's European preference clause challenges that assumption structurally. The US, our government's own February 13th filing to the EU made this explicit. American companies are deeply integrated into the European economy, employ thousands of European citizens in skilled jobs, and help Europe deliver credible defense capabilities. Cutting them out, Washington warned, risks weakening the alliance itself. The warning was accurate, but it was filed too late and from the wrong position. Washington is not offering something, it is demanding loyalty. And Europe increasingly is choosing to simply build the capability it needs, with partners who do not threaten them with tariffs between meetings. Watch for three things in the weeks and months ahead. First, watch whether the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, survives its review process intact. The agreement comes up for renewal in July 2026. Every deal Carney signs with a non-US partner strengthens his hand at the renegotiation table. Canada diversifying away from US economic dependence is not just a strategic choice, it is a negotiating posture. Second, watch the UK. If London watches Canada operate inside SAFE and sees the defense industrial benefits accumulating in real time, the political pressure to find a way back into those negotiations will intensify dramatically. A UK re-entry into European defense frameworks would represent a structural shift in post-Brexit strategy that no British politician has yet been willing to fully articulate. Third, watch Canada's non-US export numbers. If the trend that began in 2025, exports to the rest of the world rising while US-bound exports fall, continues into 2026 with safe integration providing new industrial footholds, the argument that Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada will become statistically very difficult to sustain. The geography of North American power is being redrawn, not by invasion, not by crisis, by a central banker from Ottawa who understood, before almost anyone else, that the rules had changed, and moved before Washington knew the game had started. Mark Carney went to Davos and told the world that middle powers must act together or be consumed by great powers. Then he went home, signed 12 deals, flew to Brussels, and handed Europe what the United States refused to provide: a partner with no ambivalence about which side of history it was building. Subscribe, stay tuned. Capital has no patriotism, and neither, it turns out, does sovereignty when you threaten to take it.